Well, I found plenty of good, but nothing really better. It's, everything has its strengths and weaknesses. So I wasn't convinced to learn something new. And I was wondering why all these people were leaving. And, well,
leaving the
what
community, right?
What I could do about it. I mean, I understood it very much so. And it turned out after talking to some people, and especially Willem Wichmann, I butchered his name here. I still can't pronounce it. It's Willem. So anyway, after speaking to him, he started this idea of maybe being able to change something and not just suffer through the slow demise of Magento open source. And I found that really inspiring, and decided to put my effort behind it. And instead of just, well, there's nothing I can do, the kind of feeling, it's more like, okay, it's open source. Let's take it into our own hands and be adults, take responsibility, and do something about it. Yeah.
And that's when the Mage OS initiative
started. Right, and that's where Mage OS started. So 9 months ago, we wrote this open letter. We being a group of originally around 20 people. Ryan was one of the co-writers, co-authors of the letter, and yeah, we made quite a stir back then. And one of the best parts that came out of it, it really gained Adobe's attention. I'm saying Adobe here as if, but some of the people inside of Adobe. It's all about the people in the end, right? So, and they've been very engaged since, so that's been great. And, but that's not the only thing that came out of it. But yeah, that's basically what happened. First, we said we want a fork. Now we're calling it a distribution because it's a better word for what we're doing. And it's basically all about being independent and self-sufficient. And if we can do that while working together with Adobe and with everybody in the community and the larger e-commerce ecosystem, then everybody wins. So that's what it's about.
Yeah, that sounds fair. So Ryan, what decided you to sign that initial Mage OS letter and to be part of that movement?
I saw a lot of the same things that Vinay was talking about. I had a feeling that there was some stagnation around the open source community product, that there wasn't much movement, and that the community is, I don't want to say losing steam, but there wasn't as much happening as there has been in the past. There are various reasons for that. I think the pandemic, the lack of in-person events had a large play in that. But still, I wanted to take some initiative and try to help make things better and actually do something to give back to the community that's done so much for me.
Like the true Magento spirit, that is. Eric, can you elaborate a little bit on Vinay mentioned like it got Adobe's attention. Maybe you can share a little bit what happened inside Adobe with this initiative and what the steps that's been taken afterwards.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think, Vinay and team really raised something that we've been aware of for quite some time. If you look, internally, this is something that we've wanted to bring back in a lot of the same form, but really grow and scale in a way that it hadn't been before, right? And so I think we recognized many of the same things. I think, kind of Vinay, took the initiative and did what they did. And I think that helped start to kind of shape what this looks like, because inevitably, I think the community will move faster and they will innovate, but it's part of but also part of the process as well. And so I've been, really, I think, really encouraged by having some of the real conversations that have kind of led to this. But as Vinay and others here on the call as my witness, the first couple conversations were hard, and that's okay, right? And so I think it's important to have those conversations, get everything on the table, and look at whether it's open source itself as the product, the process, how can we improve that? So Nicole's on board for continuing to evolve what that looks like, but then also get back to some of the things that MA is championing as well, because a lot of these were identified even back when the 4 pillars were announced. And so I think the action is really important on this one. And so I think if anything, that's helped us understand the problem. And I think we're working as hard as we can on the solve. And there's a lot of ways to do that, but the what and the why have been super clear.
Yeah, that's for sure. And one of the things that came out of those discussions has been the pre-discussions has been the formation of the Magento Association Open Source Task Force. Damien, you're part of that. Why did you decide to join? And can you elaborate a little bit on what the task force does and what the goal of the task force is?
Sure. So
that was a question that was mentioned in the Q&A section. So.
Sure. So I joined the task force because kind of my core thesis is that, I do a lot of builds for a lot of merchants, and we do all sorts of crazy customizations, and keeping Magento open source healthy is quintessential to that, that whole, my business, as well as a lot of the merchants that I work with. So that's kind of the main reason I joined the task force. But in essence, I'm an open source engineer. I'm a part of a lot of different ecosystems. So being a part of the PHP ecosystem and Magento specifically just made sense for me. So I decided, why not take all of the knowledge that I have from all of the things that I've worked on over the years and bring it to the community of developers that I work with all the time. So that was the kind of the main reason I joined the task force. And then in terms of what is the task force doing, or kind of what are we supposed to do? That's a hard question, but the goal is to be the guiding light for what happens next, or to discuss. Obviously, everyone here is involved in the open source product in some way. Eric from Adobe, Danny as the MA head, Vinay and Ryan and Laura, Major West, and then individual contributors. We're all part of the process. So this particularly is just about how do we bring the relevant parties together, and how do we make a group decision on what happens next. So that's kind of what the task force has been going for and discussing and coming up with different ideas and plans of attack for the past few months.
Yeah, that's for sure. And Eric, can you mention something about the steps that the task force is taking and the direction it's going? I know it's not official yet, but what are we looking at currently?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, nothing's final yet, but I think we feel like we've got a good handle on the discovery and define level activities. And so what I mean by that, we've got a lot of really smart folks on the team, like Christian Partika and others, who sat down with many of the folks from the task force and really identified, like, what are the fundamental needs here? And the reality is, I think we all have a shared understanding of that. As far as what the solve is, I think there's a lot of ways that we've talked about how that would look like and when that would look like. Again, a lot of these are actually, quite honestly, they're going to be led by the community, right? And so I think in the last couple of meetings, we finally got to the kind of the so what part of what this, and ultimately there's going to be this ownership, and as we kind of, I think, met internally even before this panel, like, what do we want people to take away from this? It's going to be really a call to action. Like, what does it mean for the community to take more ownership in this? And ultimately, especially in what we're trying to do, from a product standpoint, how do we look at contribution? How do we look at innovation? How do we look at all these things that could probably happen faster through different processes and different methods and things like that? And so it does take time. It's a fundamental change in what we're doing. It's, we're throwing as much as we can at this, but it's been a bit of a journey, but know that we are thinking about this and know this is part of our larger story, and it's going to help, I think, unlock some of the things that because I feel what kind of Vinay feels and what he shares, that we want to unlock a lot of that that's been unique to this community, which is more than just the open source product. That's part of it, but like, it's a much larger, much deeper story.
Yeah, I think there are two abbreviations floating around currently. That's an LTS and an STS version. Maybe we can elaborate a little bit on those terms and what those mean, because it's just 3-letter words right now. So
I can take a crack at that. I don't know if that was like directed at Eric. So
Damien, go for it. It's a standard term. Feel free to take that though.
Okay. So LTS, STS, these are two abbreviations: long-term support and short-term support. And I'll give kind of a general idea of what the two prospects are. They're kind of a unit, so you don't just get SDS or you don't just get LTS. It's not like we pick between the two. You would get both of them in concert. And so LTS is basically long-term support Magento with a life cycle of much longer time frames, something on the order of maybe 3 to 5 years, something in that range. And then short-term support is something that has a much shorter life cycle, something that changes a little bit more frequently, and is, it has a shorter life cycle. You change it more often. But the implementation of that is the really cool thing that the task force has been discussing over the past few years. And I want to preface this with, none of this is set in stone. None of this is final. This is, hopefully this panel is two things. First of all, information. We bring to the community what we've been discussing. And then secondarily, feedback, right? So we don't want this to be final, but we do want to bring back and say, hey, these are ideas that we've thought through, and we want to know whether or not you like the idea or hate the idea. So long-term support is intended to be kind of the main Magento repository that maintains for a longer period of time at a stable version, as I said, 3 to 5 years. And the pull requests that go into that repository are very, very limited and wholly controlled by Adobe. So those are all managed entirely by Adobe, and they are brought in much more slowly. And that's kind of the current state. STS is a completely separate repo, which would be a set of packages on top of the main Magento repository, and they would be supplemental. They might make breaking changes, but importantly, these packages are wholly community owned. So this repository is specifically, maybe it's under the Magento Association, maybe under Magento proper, but a separate permission set, but it is wholly community owned, and we the community deliver features to these repositories, and they are released as supplemental packages on top of the mainline Magento, but they release much more frequently and with much greater community control. So say, for example, there's a set of 100 developers who can approve pull requests and merge them directly. We all maybe we have some kind of consensus procedure for what that looks like, but we at least merge them more frequently. So instead of the process, which is very slow today, we have something which is much faster tomorrow. It's the general idea.
Yeah, and so STS would have more frequent releases compared to the LTS version.
Correct.
Cool. Maybe this one's for Vinay or Ryan. How would MageOS tie in together with that, with their different distribution? How we're looking at that one?
May I, Ryan? Thanks. Well, STS and LTS is a proposal, right? It's an idea. It's a promising idea that came out of the task force, but it's still very open what's actually going to happen. Right? Because many people in the task force, many people have to sign up at Adobe. I know a lot of the people inside of Adobe are working incredibly hard to make the case and to get things moving. But because there are so many people in Adobe, it just takes a lot of time. So for me, MageOS is the guarantee that we as the community or the ecosystem will have a Magento open source that is always available, regardless what happens. And we have a head start of about 6 months building it, right? So that's something that's already there. And if LTS STS happens, I hope it does. If it happens, when it happens, because currently that's also open, nobody knows, then at one point in time, if there's no longer a need for MageOS, and we have this community-owned and successful and transparent and community-supported release of Magento open source called STS, then great, no problem. And then there's no more need for MageOS as a distribution. And I am absolutely open for any of the work that we're doing with MageOS to become part of Magento STS wherever that makes sense, right? I mean, it's different things we're building to a degree, but I think that's absolutely an option. But for me, MageOS is the guarantee that things will happen, just like a lot of things were started off, at least from our perspective, by the open letter and everything that came after it. So in a way, it's a way for us to tell people this is something we really serious and care about, right? So here, we're building this ourselves, and that makes a difference. That's my perspective, at least, right? So in a way, I see it as a driving force, providing energy into the ecosystem to create change and opportunity, and to guarantee the presence of Magento open source in the long-term future.
Yeah. So Ryan, Vinay mentioned Magento is 6 months ahead of the open source task force. So what's currently being built and what's been done so far?
I'm sorry, I've got a dog barking here. I couldn't entirely hear that.
There you go. Vinay, do you want to take this one as well?
Oh yeah, there's a lot going on. So at the moment, we're building some kind of foundation, so we're able to have some funds to pay for servers, etc. But it's a different model than what the Magento Association is doing. We'll have more news about that shortly. So that's happening. We're working at the same time on content about Magento open source, because currently that's completely lacking ever since Magento.com was shut off or redirected to an upsell to Adobe Commerce. That's sorely missing. And I know that people in Adobe, again, are working for it to happen, but at the same time, I feel it would be natural not to also at least work towards the same goal. And I believe in the end, everything will kind of come together and, create that, that content will be available again. So that's happening. And then, of course, we're also building the distribution, which currently consists of, we're going step by step. We have a mirror distribution, which means we have a copy, basically, of everything you get when you install Magento open source from repo.magento.com. However, the difference is the packages, the Composer packages, are built not by Adobe and their process, which I don't have any insight into, but instead they're built by a custom-built process that we built. And what's more, we put that into a Docker image, so anybody can build their own mirror of any Magento release, right? So everything that Magento releases, we can immediately just create the same release, and then that's available independently of Adobe. So even if nobody present, of course, but who knows what's going to happen, would shut down repo.magento.com and the GitHub Magento organization, and that of course won't happen. But even if, we still would have everything, right? And so we're taking care of that. That's secure, everything that's current state. And now the next step that's currently happening is we're able to create a new release. So Composer packages based on all the developed branches of all the different repositories. So because that's not just github.com/Magento2, there's so many more. It's about a dozen repositories that have to be packaged up into many Composer packages, hundreds of Composer packages, and then that makes a build of Magento 2. So what we've got now is the tooling to create this kind of set of Composer packages that make up a build based on the current develop branch of all these different distributions. So now it's possible to install it and run tests against it and check if extensions are compatible to it and see, how does it work with new PHP versions or whatever. And that was the next step, and that's now pretty much complete. The only thing that we still have to do is we have to put it in the Docker image and make a public repository, Composer repository out of it. And then that's what we've currently got, right? The next step then will be creating tests, running tests on this build, and then finally we'll start building the repository that we can accept pull requests and actually apply changes in a sensible way. But that's another story.
A lot is going on, that's for sure. So Laura, if you hear those two different initiatives about Magento open source in the future, what do you feel, or what do you think?
Basically, what I'm looking for is to make sure that my clients aren't left on the hook. All right, I know when Magento 1 was sunsetted, it had been years in the making, but it happened so, I'm not sure what the word is, the manner in which it occurred. I mean, my clients got an email from PayPal saying you have a month to move to Magento 2 and otherwise you're out. And there was a big scramble. And it was really kind of scary there because we were on our Magento 2 migration. We still are. It's a highly customized site. It's super, super complex, and we're looking to launch it in the fall, but that was 2 years ago. So what I'm hearing here is sort of a backstop for that potentiality arising in the future, is that if Adobe does decide that, you know, the open source business just really isn't working in this particular area and decides to shut it down, that there are options. And more to the point, I feel like I would move my clients to those other options sooner rather than later, just based on how things have gone in the last 2 years or so, between PRs that kind of get left to die and issues that go back to 2015, 16 that are kind of fundamentally broken. So the idea of being able to have a lot more input into this product that we're all, you know, using for our living, making our living, would be great. So that's in a nutshell. I want to be able to make sure I'm not left dangling.
So you're missing a little bit of trust in the process and trust in the future.
Bit. It's not at any individuals, as I want to be clear. Adobe is a massive, massive, massive company. You know, Magento is a big company, at least to someone like myself, but Adobe is just beyond big. So there's a lot of stakeholders there that don't even know what Magento is, that have decision-making power. So I feel like you can't necessarily trust all the way up to the top there a little bit, because things can happen in big companies that the people that you work with have no control over. So it's a way, this Mage OS initiative really speaks to me as somebody who is, you know, telling my clients to build on Magento and not worrying that I'm going to regret that decision.
Yeah, so it's giving a little bit of trust.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So Eric, anything that Adobe can do or is currently doing about that? Lack of trust from, I guess, the community, and what any future plans that are shareable currently?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, this came up quite a bit in our first discussions with the task force as I became more actively involved. So I've been with MA as liaison for about a year or so ago, and we wanted to proactively get to a situation where like we could really take care of some of the things that Laura had mentioned. I think in terms of trust it's built, right? It's not something that happens overnight, and like any other companies, there's been a lot of changes, and the things that Laura and many others have mentioned are pretty common themes. We documented, really started to break those down into requirements and started to share those collectively in terms of response times around PRs. One of the things that I, if I could have just had like one slide this morning with Nicole is Adobe's commitment to open source, right? And so regardless of releases and what have you, that part's clear. I asked that question a lot. And so I think that's incredibly important. That's an incredibly important statement to make. But we've got to find ways to grow and scale with where the energy is happening around the community, which after a couple of years, you want to make sure that you're doing the right things and doing your very best to address the speed and the growing nature of any commerce platform as part of that. So yeah, I think it does take time. I think these are common themes that we've heard. We are looking at some of these processes, and we're also looking to the community to pick some of these parts up. But we also recognize, and as the community does as well, this is not something that like, trust, we're good next week. With a change, it's going to take a little while, and we understand that as well. We're doing what we can to really establish that and find ways and places for those who've been with our community for a while to help grow and expand.
That's for sure. So Ryan, do you see a different Adobe if you compare it before the Mage OS announcement? Is Adobe more engaged in building back trust?
From an outside perspective, I do somewhat. I think a lot of that's been driven by the Magento Association, by the involvement from Eric Orway and others. Outwardly, they've been very open about supporting the initiatives and what's moving. And that does give me a lot of hope about what will happen in the future. But at the same time, going back to Laura's point, we need assurance for the long term, regardless of what happens or doesn't happen there.
And how do we get that? What's needed?
That personally, that goes back to the MageOS initiative, but I think there are a lot of parallels there with the STS idea that Damien covered as well, which is that one way or another, we are dealing with open source here. There is going to be a repository and packages out there, regardless of who is behind them and who is driving them. So this isn't going anywhere.
Yeah. If we deep dive a little bit more into the STS and LTS version, we've got a question there on, let's see. So how will stuff be merged from STS into LTS, and might be vice versa as well? We did have that discussion in the task force. Damien, can you take that one?
Yeah, so the idea is at the end of an LTS release, so at the end of life of an LTS release, when we go from, let's say, 2.4.5 to 2.6 or something like that, internal Adobe engineering would pick features out of STS, which become mainline Magento features. So they go into the LTS release. Not every single release of, or every single feature that's in STS will be brought in to LTS at every single release. So there might be something that maybe it's very preliminary, or maybe it's not really a well understood feature yet that's in STS that won't be ported back. But that would be up to the Adobe engineering to bring into LTS.
Yeah, the other interesting point that we talked about is security patches, because they will go into the LTS version and they need to be merged back into the STS version as well. Eric, did we already land on something on how that would work? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's very preliminary. Nothing's official at this point. I think there's some really good ways to do it. This is a process that, if we were to consider it, is a standard, right? And so, like, if you look at this, our real goal with open source, regardless of the releases, is around security, is around, quality, and really, like we said this morning, like really finding the true core as part of that. Like, but then how do we look at ways though with the community to essentially cherry pick the things that we think could help downstream, not even just with LTS, but also commerce as a whole. Like in a weird way, it's almost we're looking at a distributed way to solve a problem that we once did in a much more, monolithic maybe kind of way, and that's good, right? And so, but it takes a lot of coordination, a lot of agreements, and it also means a lot of work possibly for the community as well. So even simple things like AWS costs and things like that for the community to pick some of this up is not it's not trivial, right? And so we've got to really think through that to make sure we do that well, and then really look at the focus where really is around innovation and or the Adobe guarantees, which are going to be around quality, security, things like that. That the community is interested in it, but they would imagine want to work on some of the other areas as well to expand and bring some more innovation into the platform.
And what if there's hypothetically a STS version which is community based and there's an LTS version which is created by Adobe? How would that work together? Like, how would architectural decisions be made and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's very preliminary. I mean, nothing is official, and so
big disclaimer, but
too early to tell. But what is right, and so it is. I mean, it's something that wouldn't it be great if we could have done this in a couple of weeks and we say, hey, here is but we're looking at Manayo and others have thought about architectural guilds and other forums to use those as means that we've kind of done in the past to look at a series of agreements, whether it's at the package level, whether it's at the release level, or what have you. It's super preliminary though, because it's going to require effort on both sides, and that's really where we are at that point in the story of like, hey, there's going to be a lot of work for the community for this, and how would they pick that up? But there is this idea of having an architectural council to make sure that one of the fundamental principles in anything we do, call it LTS, STS, or what have you, or anything, even a distribution, is that of compatibility. Because when we're compatible, we avoid the situations like Laura describes, where you have the end merchants. So we can call it what you want, and I'm just a simple product person. I think more about that. I think about the migrations. I think about the end customer experience, especially as they go, grow with the platform for that one. So I look at it from that. But yeah, it's super early.
Yeah, what's interesting is that both initiatives need the community in order to move forward. So if we talk a little bit about that, Vinay, how can people contribute to MageOS, for instance, and what does that look like?
Right. Yeah, that's a good point and something I've been wondering about. So currently, there's a Discord server set up for MageOS. It's linked from several blog posts from the mageos.org website. That's probably the best place to get started. So currently, we are not in a situation where we can accept pull requests to Magento open source, right? Where we haven't built that infrastructure yet. But the next step, for example, will be set up continuous integration based on those nightly builds, which then will be the next step, set it up for all other repos and for pull requests, etc. So it's one step at a time. So anybody who has experience with that would be, any help is very welcome, because to be fair and frank, we don't have all that expertise in our group at all. So a lot of it has been, okay, let's figure it out. So we'll have to sit down and try and figure out a way to get stuff done. And that's what we're doing wherever it's necessary. But anybody who already knows their stuff, or who also wants to figure stuff out while just working on a problem, then that's great. That's perfect. There are many ideas that we've got, and there's a lot of areas to help. Another big place that I think help is very welcome is content creation about Magento open source. So people writing comparisons with between platforms, and really fair ones, not sales articles, but fair comparison, feature wise, maintenance wise, all the aspects, case studies, these kind of things. Why would somebody want to pick Magento open source to build upon? And why not? Fair information there. These kind of things that a merchant would want to read. So anybody who's written content like that or would like to create content like that would also be very welcome. And of course, once we're at a stage where we can accept pull requests, or who's interested in steering Magento forward and participating in that way, then that will be great too. It's just that we're currently not yet able to do that.
Yeah,
working towards it.
And Damien, Eric, is there anything that people already can do to contribute to the Magento open source task force or to that hypothetical STS version?
STS doesn't exist, right? And so, but I think feedback is welcome, right? And so I think one of the things we thought would be really good is to find ways to expand feedback beyond kind of the 13, the 13 that we have, right? And so I think we MA has set up an email that we can send afterwards. I may pop it in the chat, but essentially it's like Magento open source TF at magentoassociation.org. We want feedback. There's likely something we've missed. There's a big consideration that we may want to make sure that that we're all thinking about. And I think it's well represented with the cross section that MA had picked, but let's get that out there and understand how that works and what this might look like together to make sure that we've got everything covered. So yeah, I think feedback is always helpful. And feedback could come in the form of timing or come in the form of what have you. But we want to open up those channels in a way we haven't quite yet. We've been looking at this for a while, and so I think now is the time for that. So I'll put that into the chat, and we can send it afterwards.
It's already in the chat, so.
Oh, good.
Please send your feedback to that email address, and that will be up for discussion in the task force, and that will be really helpful. Let's see, Ryan. So there are two different initiatives, and do you think those two initiatives are bringing the community together, or is it more like splitting the community apart currently?
I think they both have their benefits, and I think there's a lot of room for projects and contributors to all collaborate, regardless of where they're doing it. But on the whole, we're not looking to fracture anything. We want to make the community and the ecosystem stronger. Both projects have that same vision. We aim to bring people together. It's all going to be one community. We're not talking about making major breaking changes here fundamentally it's all going to be the same Magento platform, and it's all going to work together. The technical details of that still remain to be seen, but like Vinay and Damien were touching on earlier, it's very possible that contributions to one might also affect the other or be applicable to the other. So it's possible that the projects have different visions about where Magento will be going or what it should become, which could certainly lead to differences in how we accomplish that. But on the whole and altogether, I think those differences are likely to make the ecosystem stronger more than anything.
Yeah. And what are the differences between the two initiatives that you see, and what are the similarities?
It's a little difficult to say at this point because so much of this is still off in the future. We don't have the projects that people can submit pull requests to or anything of the sort yet. And obviously, I'm a little biased here coming from the MageOS side. I think the benefits that we have with MageOS are a little more freedom to act quickly, a little more independence, more community-driven, and more openness and transparency in how we do things. Anyone can come into our Discord and start getting involved right now. I'd welcome everyone to do so that's watching. Use all the help we can get. We're all in this together.
Vinay, do you see a possibility that there would be a hard fork that we've seen with other open source projects where they're just not backwards compatible anymore?
Not in the foreseeable future. Several reasons for that. One is that backward incompatible changes suck. It makes upgrades super hard for merchants. Nobody wants them. Nobody who's using the product wants them. It's always painful and costs a lot of money and time. So staying compatible is a huge value proposition. The second thing is that one of the reasons why we want to guarantee Magento open source continues to thrive is because of the very large ecosystem of companies built around it. Many companies have built their own products on top of it, be it extension vendors. There are many people who have built, very niche commerce solutions around B2B or B2B2C and so on Magento open source. That's a completely different target segment compared to Adobe Commerce again and price segment. And there are thousands of businesses built on top of this. And then there are all the agencies, of course. And with a hard fork that it becomes incompatible, we would be breaking with all of that, which basically is part of the reason why we're doing this, right? So we're not interested in that at all. We think extensions, for example, are one of the huge values that exist, and all the existing integration with all the different providers of services in the e-commerce space, right? All of that exists. So why should we, make it not work anymore? It's no reason there. And now, if Adobe, that's the scary scenario here. If Adobe were to decide we are going to break that, we'll only do SaaS and only cloud and no more on-premise and so on, then all those that would be the break, right? But it wouldn't come from our side. It would come from Adobe's side in that case. And in that case, we would still have the whole ecosystem being able to continue to function and evolve, based on MageOS. That's the whole idea there. And I really believe that upward compatibility is a strength there. It would also allow work and security patches and everything that has been done in one distribution to be ported over into the other distributions, back and forth. The whole ecosystem will be stronger. And there's still a lot that can happen to make, to distinguish one distribution from another.
Yeah. So, and that will keep the community together as well. That's what you're saying.
Well, the one thing that I haven't found a good answer yet is if somebody opens a pull request in one point in the future, which repository does it choose? Well, probably not LTS if that exists, because the chances to get that merged are slim. So probably STS, right? Or maybe MageOS, or maybe both, or how would that work? We'll have to figure that out. I'm sure we will. We have patches, thank God, which make work like that possible. But that's something we'll see.
That's going to be.
That's why I think it's so good to keep communicating. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, that's for sure. And that's also why MageOS, or you as part of MageOS, are within the task force. So Damien, how do you feel like the cooperation within the task force is, and with Vinay being on the other initiative as well?
It's great. I mean, regardless, all feedback is valuable. So as Ryan somewhat touched on, there's a very high probability that anything that's submitted to STS is directly applicable to MageOS, right? So any supplemental package that would wind up in STS can be pulled into MageOS. So there's no difference in that regard. In addition, Vinay has always had the best interest of Magento at heart. So I don't really see any particular issues. I think it's always been collaborative, so I don't see any. So there's been a lot of consideration, like, is STS or MageOS the final, right? Which one wins? And the answer is, I think it's a collaboration and probably a combination of both that becomes the ultimate Magento open source. But it's all just feedback driven at this point. It's going to be a lot of community contributions to both and seeing which one people like.
Yeah, interesting question. Sorry, Vinay, do you?
Oh, okay, fair.
You raise your hand.
Let's do this question. Let's do the question.
Somebody mentioned in Q&A if there's already an STS document about the that we can review and provide feedback upon. I know that in the task force we had a discussion about documenting stuff. Anyone want to take that question? Like, what's the current state and how do we look at that within the task force?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very early days, right? I mean, it's a collection of thoughts, outlines. I think we've got some ideas on, but I think I think it's too early to share. STS is still in its early days. We have an idea of the problem itself, but the solve, I think we've got to figure that out before we get too widespread. So.
Yeah, there's no document yet, but we've been talking about the process on how we should do things architecturally.
Yeah.
So if anyone has feedback, just send it to that email address. That's definitely helpful. And there we go to Vinay.
Thanks. I would like to add to that the reason why that document doesn't exist, or part of the reason at the current state, is, for one, of course, because it's not official or anything, but it could be in draft form. The one thing that, from my point of view, is currently trying to be figured out by this task force is, how can the community, for lack of a better word, or people out of the community, take ownership of STS, and which basically means doing the work, right, for free, and that's a requirement for it to work. So the reason why I wanted to touch on that right now is, anybody who feels the calling there, who wants to step up and put in some work and think, hey, that would be interesting, let's do that. Let's shape the future of Magento there. Yes, this is where you can do it. And it would be great to get people in who want to do this. Because this work is not just developing, it's also writing documents like that and participating in the discussions and just spending time on the problems that we are trying to solve here. And that's all of it, including these documents.
Yes, totally agree. I'm looking at my question list. How do we feel about a truly independent, community-driven version of Magento? That's never been the case, whereas other open source projects are community-driven for a long time. Magento has always been driven from a company. How do we feel about a community-driven version of Magento open source? Laura, can you share your vision on that?
It's kind of funny, as a developer, I'd be like, yeah, man, I'm all over that. But as someone who has actual clients, I have to say that I'd be very loath to jettison Adobe just yet in favor of that, unless I had a really, really compelling reason. Because I would find it personally a lot of fun to work on that. And but then that's just me as a developer. When it comes down to it, at the end of the day, I'm doing work for clients, and that's their shop that's going to make or break depending on what platform it's built on. So if as Vinay said, it would have to take Adobe deciding we're done for me to make that decision for my clients, I think, at this point, because it's just too risky. A lot of them look at it as sort of like, why would we do open source? I mean, I remember having this discussion back in like 2010 when I first encountered Magento. And it's like they wanted to do demandware. It's like, why would we use this free stuff? It can't be any good because it's free. So there's a little bit of that mindset still. So if you were to tell a client or a merchant, well, we could go with this community-driven initiative, or we could go with Adobe. I think they're always going to say, let's go with Adobe, unless of course they have to pay like a lot of money for it, which in that case they would probably go for the community-driven version. But all things being equal, I think I would have to see if Adobe were to sort of make the first shot across the bow, if you will, in order to make that move.
Ryan, anything that you can add to that from an agency perspective?
That's an interesting question. I don't entirely agree with Laura on that, which is to say, I think it's a lot of matter of perspective on the part of the merchant or the user. We've been talking with a client recently who's actually really interested in the idea of a community-driven product that's independent of that oversight. So I think it really comes down to how risk averse, I guess, the merchant is.
Depending on the merchant, that is.
Yeah.
Ultimately,
it's going to depend on what the projects actually produce and what kind of history and trust they're able to build up with people.
Yeah. And I guess that will be hard for both initiatives, right? As the SCS version as well as the MageOS version. That's the case.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Another interesting thing is that what Vinay touched base on is not only the community should come together and participate in it, but eventually funding is also needed. Vinay already mentioned something about funding of MageOS. Can you share a little bit more about what that looks like and how could a community-driven version of Magento be funded?
Yes, definitely. So I think a model similar to the Typo 3 Association would work pretty well. Basically, this means a fully member-owned through membership fees structure. And if there's a lot of money, great. But if there's not a lot of money, that just means everything goes a bit slower. Right? So it's more of a matter of scaling the organization to fit the budget rather than the other way around. And the reason why I think that's a good idea to be member-owned is as soon as we would be relying on sponsors or on specific companies too much, then it wouldn't be independent anymore. And well, again, that's one of the underlying principles of MageOS to be free and independent. Right? That's the idea there. Not saying that's the only right way forward, but it is for MageOS. So I believe it's possible to have sufficient funding to run a successful distribution through this model. And we would have a base membership level, which is, I can't share the numbers yet there because I would have to first talk to the others, but the base membership level will be adjusted based on the price parity, purchasing power parity index, like the Big Mac index or maybe the WMF or whatever. And so it's basically the same price for anybody everywhere for single members. And then there's also companies, small companies, medium companies, large companies, or something like that, which it would be more expensive. And the reason why companies would do that is that they would be directly supporting the product that they're built upon, right? That guarantees their existence in the future and all their clients. So, and I think because the organization could be set up from the beginning in that way, it would be a lot less it would feel much more appropriate compared to something that happened with a Magento association, where Patreon is used as a platform. It's kind of, I guess it works, but it's a little weird for me, to be honest, right? I know Patreon, I'm supporting some D&D podcasters and whatever that I like, content creators. It's a completely different model. And now suddenly this is like different membership levels. And for the association, for voting rights and stuff, it's a bit different. It feels like retroactively fitting this model on top of organization is harder rather than building the organization from the beginning in that way. But we'll see how that turns out. But that's the idea.
Yeah, and having the appropriate tools there is necessary as well. So, yeah. And Damien, from your part of the task force, if would you be, as a agency, be willing to sponsor something like a community-driven version?
Yeah, 100%. But an important kind of caveat to all of this, especially with something like SCS, is that whatever it ends up being is Adobe sanctioned. So in terms of the net spend of an agency or the net spend of an individual contributor, you will have to spend less money. You can exchange money for time, of course, but Adobe would be fronting a lot of the bill, which is nice. DevOps infrastructure isn't free, so that's an important consideration from the funding perspective. So one of the important key takeaways for the task force for this panel is going to be, what are everyone's independent decisions and ideas about funding, regardless of if it's MageOS or STS. What does that look like? And then additionally, how do we, the community in either situation, take ownership? And what does that process look like? Who, in the Linux world, we have not so much Linus anymore, but we did for a while have a BDFL. How do we approach that same concept in the community, Magento community? There's no individual there's no one individual who's like the Magento king, right? As I love to say, Willem is God King, but there's not just one person, there's a group of people. So funding and leadership are the two important takeaways that we need to figure out.
That's for sure, and that's for both initiatives, I guess. So, and we are on the top of the hour. So on the main stage, there is the town hall. And I would like to thank all the participants of this panel to be here. Thank you for your time. Thank you for joining. If you have any feedback, please email that to the email address mentioned in the chat. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much too.
Thank you.
Good.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for watching.